what really happened with your host, Mike Rivero, because World War III is a really bad idea. Here is your host, Michael Rivero.
And aloha, America. Welcome back to our show. Hour number 2. The phone lines are open, 800-313-9443. Now, apparently, we are seeing this story. This is out of McClatchy, where part of James Comey's FBI's Russian influence probe is looking at far-right news websites, which presumably would include me. And basically what they're doing is they're going forward from that now discredited list at Washington Post and the now discredited list at Harvard University that claimed any websites that were supporting Donald Trump and opposing Hillary Clinton were working as arms of Russian propaganda. We even made up a celebratory coffee mug here. Proud member of Washington Post's arm of Russian propaganda list. So, just like they're taking newspaper stories and treating them as established fact in the hearings, they're now taking these accusations that pro-Trump, anti-Hillary websites are agents of Russia, and they're actually starting investigations. And it really is a revival of McCarthyism, where if you dare post a story about how Hillary allowed the sale of 20% of America's uranium to a Russian-owned company at the same time Russia was pouring in donations to the Clinton Foundation, well, you must be an arm of Russian propaganda. And it's a very dangerous trend, obviously. And it betrays the utter fear the establishment has. They have lost control over the minds of America, and if they think coming down with a pogrom on truth activists is going to make anything better, it's not going to work. They even tried that in the Soviet Union. It just hastened the collapse. Now then, as a gentleman early in the show called in to mention, Judge Napolitano has been benched by Fox News. He's off the air. Nobody's saying anything. Fox News will not comment. Judge Napolitano will not comment. But apparently the issue is his claims that British intelligence helped the Obama administration wiretap or surveil. Let's stop using wiretap. They keep jumping on that and saying there's no more wiretaps. And they pulled him off, and that's it. And what really got people looking at this was Judge Napolitano should have been a commentator on yesterday's, and today's hearings of Gorsuch's confirmation. And he wasn't there, and everybody said, what's going on? And they started making calls and said, well, Napolitano is benched for the moment, indefinitely. He's not fired, but they're not letting him on the air. And apparently, anonymous leaks from within Fox News are saying that Napolitano is not expected to be on the air anytime in the near future. And as I mentioned to that caller, the overreaction strikes me as confirmation Napolitano was onto something. And that, of course, is going to strike panic into the heart of the Democrats and Obama himself. Because the Democrats have always carried along like only Republicans could have a Watergate scandal. And it looks like they've got another one growing on their hands right now. And it's not going to go away. And I'm sure that they're out there saying, we can't survive another scandal on this scale. It'll destroy the government. Well, if the government behaves like this, it should be destroyed. Meanwhile, Tomi Lahren has been suspended from the Blaze. Apparently, she's a little too independent thinking for them, and she's standing her ground. She's tweeted out, I have moderate, conservative, and libertarian views. I'm human. I will never apologize to anyone for being an independent thinker. Good for you. We all have to be independent thinkers. It is a mistake to suborn your best analysis of what's going on underneath a label like Republican or Democrat, conservative or liberal. We all need to be independent thinkers right now if we're ever going to get out of this mess. All right, let's grab ourselves a phone call. Mark in North Carolina. Aloha. Welcome to the show. What's on your mind?
Yeah, how you doing, Mike?
Doing
Mike, a couple of things. One about Judge Napolitano. I already went in their Facebook and Fox News Facebook, and said I don't watch them very much anyway. Very seldom, very rarely, but every once in a while. Most of the time they'll be on, like when I work out at the gym or something. I told them I'm not going to bother with them, and I urged other listeners to start boycotting them and try to bankrupt the station. This is not the first time they did something like this to Napolitano. He had his own show one time on Fox Business a few years ago.
Yes.
And they took him off because he was too independent-minded. As far as Tommy Lauren goes, you shouldn't be surprised. Remember, the psycho, the sick mental case, Glenn Beck, is the one who owns the place. So, anything that clown does doesn't surprise me. So, like I said, he's a sick mental case, and why he's even on the air anymore, I don't know. Why anybody would even watch that?
He's serving the empire. He's serving the empire. Well, I got into the habit of having Fox News on my studio monitor here, and I got the closed captioning turned on, so I don't have to make any noise with it. But I have noticed, while they were standing their ground as a conservative viewpoint during the election last year, all of a sudden they seem to become be heading into as much liberal hysteria as these other news networks. And obviously, I know they've been through a management change over there, and obviously the new management is out there saying we have to get on board with protecting the establishment. And yes, they're dealing drugs and they're assassinating people, and the Bushes and Clintons are terrible folk, but it's our establishment and we're going to protect them.
They're total fake news, just like CNN is. The only difference is they do have somebody like a Hannity who's
yes.
much more independent.
Yes.
And actually getting better the last year or so. And they had the judge, which now unfortunately they don't have. And they don't have Lou Dobbs, of course. But Dobbs, I want to see Dobbs speaking out on this. If he does, then I'm going to lose respect for him. Because he's got too many neocons constantly commenting on his show. So that's what's kind of disappointing. As far as Russia goes, I'm going to tell you, most people do not buy this crap about Russia. Okay, most people, if you look at the internet, the real news, you'll see that people love Putin, and that's really hardcore American, what you would call conservatives, real middle Americans. They love the man. They think that he's a true patriot for Russia, and that he's a bulwark against globalism.
Absolutely, that's why they hit him, and he's a bulwark against private central banking. The day that Russia went from trusted friend and ally to our worst adversary was the day that Putin took direct government control of their central bank in order to manage Russia's public currency as a public utility. That was when Putin went to the top of the special high-interest targets list.
And you know what? That's something else I wanted to call you about earlier. What Trump should do, instead of running away from Russia and sending troops into Syria and wherever else, and putting even more troops there on the border of Russia, he should copy Putin. And he should smash down on the central banks here in this country and take control of them, as Putin did.
Well, at this point, to me it is very obvious that the people surrounding Donald Trump have managed to convince him that the only way to prevent the collapse of the United States is with a world war. There's actually merit in that argument. My concern is we're likely to lose this next one. And it's unfortunate, but as far as I can't see a third way. I was sincerely, open to the possibility that Donald Trump, if he was as independent as he certainly appeared to be during the campaign, was going to help turn this country around and start that long, slow march back to being a constitutional republic with a democratically elected government, elected by an open, transparent, honest election system. But at this point, Trump is still playing defensive. He made a huge mistake trying to be magnanimous in victory and allowing so many of the Obama people to stay on over. And again, it goes right back to my primary critique about Donald Trump. He is as naive about Washington, D.C. politics going into the job as Jimmy Carter was.
Right. Well, one other thing, too, what you say about World War III, I kind of disagree with you on that. I think I go along with what Einstein said. He said that you fight World War III with these type of weapons, you'll fight World War IV with sticks and stones, and I tend to believe that's exactly what would happen.
I agree. I agree. I mean, I find it very alarming that some of the movie channels on our cable box, they've started rerunning On the Beach. Gregory Peck film was a very strong anti-nuclear statement, and all of a sudden they seem to think, oh, people are going to want to see this one, end of the world from nuclear weapons and everything. Anyway, listen, Mark, we're going to let you go here. I'm going to do a quick shout-out to our on-air affiliates just now rejoining our network. And getting on over to the war zones, emphasis on the plural, the U.S. is launching a soaring number of airstrikes in Iraq and Syria, ostensibly against ISIS. But again, certainly in the case of Syria, Assad does not want those airstrikes, and Assad is still insisting the U.S. is actually hitting civilian infrastructure. And unfortunately, there's huge civilian casualties from the American bombing. But it does seem that Trump has been convinced that he has to continue this agenda of conquest and forcing the world back to Bretton Woods, or the U.S. is finished. And there are other ways to save the United States of America. They're not easy, they're not quick, but they could be done without huge amounts of bloodshed and radioactive debris all over the planet. Now then, the Kurds are saying the Pentagon plans to send another 1,000 troops to Syria in the coming weeks. Apparently, the U.S. is trying to stage an invasion below the radar. There's a few thousand here, a couple of thousand there, a couple of thousand there, a couple of thousand there. But it's still an invasion, because the United States does not have the permission of the Syrian government to be on Syrian territory. President Obama does not have, President Trump does not have a formal declaration of war by the United States Congress. President Trump does not have a resolution from the United Nations Security Council. And it is insane to continue this. And it could easily wind up as a direct conflict with Russia. And we may be closer to that than ever before. Now, Netanyahu has been out there demanding Russia stop airstrikes in Syria, because Israel's attitude is that unless Daesh can take over Syria and bring down Assad, Israel will collapse. Because Syria is obviously Iran's proxy in the region. That's their thinking. Netanyahu is begging Putin, please don't bomb Syria anymore. Please don't bomb Daesh and the terrorist groups. They're on our side. They're helping us. Putin has come on back in response to that ugly incident where Israel bombed Syrian forces to protect the terrorists. And Putin has sent an unequivocal message: your freedom to act in Syria is over. And that is a pretty crystal clear message. And then to punctuate it, Russia used a sub-launch cruise missile to attack the rebels Israel defended with their airstrikes in Palmyra. And that is a very clear, unequivocal message. Now, if Israel had wise and prudent leadership, they would back on down, because they know Syria is not a threat to Israel. Israel just wants to grab more of Syria. The danger here is that during the administration of George W. Bush, the United States signed a memorandum of understanding with the government of Israel that the United States will come in to any conflict involving Israel on Israel's side, even if Israel starts the battle, the conflict. And so right now there is a quasi-legal, if you will, paper trail by which Israel could attack Russian forces in Syria. When Russia retaliates, the U.S. would come on in and go head-to-head with Russia. And then Israel would very quietly pull back and stand in a corner laughing themselves silly while the United States and Russia destroy each other, leaving Israel with their nuclear arsenal basically calling the shots on planet Earth. I don't think Israel would mind that outcome one tiny bit. They've already bled the United States for all the money and weapons they're ever going to get. We're a hollowed-out shell. We've been sucked dry. Trump is also expanding special forces deployments around Africa and the Mideast. And we have now had the first U.S. carrier return to the Gulf since Trump's inauguration. Apparently the USS George H.W. Bush is heading into the Gulf through the Strait of Hormuz. And of course, the Iranians are coming on out to take a look. And the corporate media is saying, oh, Iran is showing hostile actions. Iran is showing hostile actions. No, Iranian warships in the Gulf of Mexico, that's a hostile action. Iranian warships off the coast of California, that's a hostile action. Iranian patrol boats patrolling their own border in the face of American weapons of war is common sense. Now, the United Nations has proved once again that they have become largely irrelevant in the world. As you know, a report was issued by the United Nations declaring that there is absolutely no question that Israel's government is an apartheid one. There's the Israelis, and then there's the Arabs, the Palestinians. And both the United States and Israel put a tremendous amount of pressure on the United Nations to withdraw the report. And the senior United Nations official, Rima Khalaf, resigned in the face of this incredible pressure to get her to withdraw the UN report. Well, once she had resigned, whoever was assigned to take over her desk, as it were, went ahead and withdrew the report. It's been Orwellized. It's no longer there. The UN doesn't think Israel is an apartheid state. All will be well. Remember that old saying, to learn who rules over you, simply find out who you are not allowed to criticize. That quote is attributed to Voltaire, but the indications are it actually came from a guy named Kevin Alfred Strom. Now, do you remember last October there was a big stink at the University College of London where this Israeli soldier showed up, and there was all kinds of disruption, and the Israeli students, the Jewish students, felt afraid that there was some kind of activism going on. Apparently, according to this article over an electronic intifada, the infiltrators who rushed into there and made a ruckus were being funded by Israel. Remember what I said yesterday on the show? The only Nazis running around today are hired actors in costumes to manufacture a scare so that organizations claiming to oppose Nazism can solicit more donations. It's a scam. It's a fraud. It's a hoax. It's exactly what it is. Now then, this gets us down to a rather interesting story over in upstate New York. Andrew King in Schenectady called the police because swastikas had been painted on his house. He is, needless to say, a Jewish gentleman, and he was out there getting a lot of media attention and saying he was going to be proud to leave the swastikas on his home as a reminder of how Jewish people are victimized and oppressed in the United States. To nobody's surprise, it turns out he painted those swastikas on his own home, and he's in jail right now awaiting arraignment for filing a false police report. Just a little reminder, by way of deception thou shalt conquer. Now, NATO may have actually taken a step back from the war agenda. We're coming up on a commercial break. When we come on back, kind of an interesting little development, a little bit of face saving going on, but possibly a positive sign about to happen. We'll be right back. And aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. Boy, I must have said something that really bothered somebody because my server's under attack again. They are such children, aren't they? Now then, getting on over to Europe. NATO Secretary General Jens Stoltenberg has come on out and said that in point of fact, the Baltic countries really are not at risk of military attack from Russia. He's actually out there saying there is no Russian attack. He says, we're alarmed at Russia's possible intentions. That's what's setting the military possible. They might decide somewhere in the future to do something bad. But apparently he's responding to entreaties from Lithuania, Latvia, and Estonia, saying we really don't need to have as many people along that border. And he's actually out there saying it's important we do not over-dramatize the situation. I wonder if he's going to be replaced real soon here. Now then, the United States is crying foul. Russia's just tested their 9M729 cruise missile. And the U.S. is screaming that it is a violation of what's called the INF, the Intermediate Nuclear Force Treaty, which was negotiated in the 1980s. And basically the treaty bans cruise missiles with a range between 500 kilometers and 5,500 kilometers. And the U.S. is out there saying, obviously, this new missile travels farther than 500 kilometers, but Russia is basically dropping hints that it may be INF compatible because its range is actually above that window set in the 1980s, 5,500 kilometers, which makes it very, very potent. Then, of course, Russia came on back and said, really, it's the United States that violated the INF because the Aegis ashore ballistic missile defense systems in Poland and Romania use the Mark 41 vertical launch cells, which can carry the Tomahawk cruise missile, whose range falls within the INF parameters. See, as long as the Tomahawks were air-carried or on ships, they were outside the INF. But the U.S. government has been developing these shore-based Aegis installations that use the Mark 41 vertical launch tubes and carry the Tomahawk cruise missiles, and they're clearly in violation of the INF. So it's another case of the United States government screaming that other countries are violating treaties that the United States is already in violation of, like they did with Iran, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty here. Now, the White House is considering sweeping sanctions on North Korea, and they're going to cut North Korea off from the global financial system. Well, SWIFT already did that last week. The electronic financial transaction system that serves much of the globe, not all of it anymore, shut off North Korea last week. What's going to happen in North Korea? Same thing happened in Russia. They're going to learn to be more self-sufficient and independent. And the fact that they're going back to the sanctions signals that Tillerson did not get what he wanted from either the interim president of South Korea or China. They're not on board with a war right on their shores. The interim president of South Korea, who may become the permanent president in the next election, is basically a follower of the Sunshine Policy, which was their name for reunification. 6 years ago, they were talking about reunifying Korea the way Germany had been reunified, and that was derailed by U.S. intrigues. But the fact that they're talking about sanctions tells me that Tillerson did not get the warm reception for an outright military invasion of North Korea. North Korea has come on out and said they have no fear of U.S. sanctions, and they are not going to change any of their policies. So we have this other article. This is from Sputnik News. The Korean crisis, the U.S. next phase of pan-Eurasian containment. In other words, North Korea is just another stepping stone on U.S. power projection around the world. And when you look at the history of the Korean War, you'll realize this is another quagmire waiting to happen. Because technically, the Korean War never ended. Something to keep in mind. All right, we're going to take a break for commercials. We'll be right back. Aloha, America. Welcome back to the show. We're talking about what's going on over in Korea, and we're talking about this article out of Sputnik News on how Korea is the next phase of pan-Eurasian containment. In other words, North Korea is just the first step on power projection into Asia, the Asia pivot, they like to call it. And that probably is one of the reasons why South Korea is so nervous about it. China is certainly nervous about it. China knows that China and the yuan are definitely on the U.S. government's special high-interest targets list. Other countries in the area that remember the last time the U.S. was projecting power over there, like Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos. They can't be happy about the United States coming back to that part of the world. But if you remember the history of the Korean War, it may not be that easy. Technically, the Korean War never ended. It's been a ceasefire all this time. Neither side is claiming victory or admitting defeat. The Korean War never really stopped. It just got put on hold. And they drew a line across that 30th parallel, and they filled it full of landmines, and that was basically it. They sit on either side of that line, and they sneer at each other. They broadcast loud music and propaganda on giant speakers. But if you remember the history of the Korean War, it was a quagmire. And the North Koreans are very tough. During the Korean War, U.S. warplanes dropped enough bombs to kill 1/3 the population of North Korea, and still they did not quit. We're already mired in quagmires in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, Libya, Yemen, who knows where all else, and they want to take on another quagmire. It's not going to work. It is just not going to work. Now, one of the reasons that Beijing may have been very cool on a U.S. plan for military engagement with North Korea is that China is upset with the United States, first of all, over the tensions in the islands in the South China Sea, which, again, going back to the end of World War II, the Allies all agreed these islands belong to China. And Japan disputes that, even though Japan lost the war. And as part of the surrender, which was for the most part unconditional on Japan's part, the only condition they had was they got to keep their emperor. That was it. Everything else. And part of the surrender process was all of those Chinese islands Japan had taken over were returned to China. It's another case of the U.S. failing to live up to treaty commitments. The other issue, of course, is that the United States has just made a huge weapons deal with Taiwan. Basically, it's an upgrade package. Now, the Obama administration halted a $1 billion arms sale to Taiwan before leaving office. But there's talk about reviving it, and China's very, very nervous about that. That China-Taiwan situation is another possible flashpoint. Taiwan wants to be an independent nation. They actually act like an independent nation. China claims Taiwan is part of China, and they just sort of put up with that independent streak with as much dignity and tolerance as they can. And the situation is stable at the moment, but anytime the United States pours more weapons into Taiwan, China is not going to look on that in a very positive light, and that is complicating the issue as well. So let's turn to the economic news here. Bank of America Merrill Lynch poll of investors, looking at basically $500 billion of assets worldwide, is saying the world stocks are now the most overvalued in 17 years. That's a result of all of this market rigging in order to use the stock market as a political banner. See, the economy is fine. Look how the stock market is doing. Pay no attention to all those hungry and homeless and unemployed people. Just look at the stock market numbers. That'll prove how great the economy is. And it really isn't. Yes, they can rig the numbers up that high, but it doesn't actually represent real wealth. One of the beliefs that people who invest in stocks, who do not know the industry very well, is that if you buy a stock for $10 today, and tomorrow that stock is selling for $20, that you have made $10, you are $10 richer. It sounds good. It certainly looks good on a brokerage report, but in point of fact, that stock that you bought at $10 is only worth what you get when you finally get around to selling it. And of course, if you have a large number of people selling a stock, the price immediately goes down. So all that wealth you thought you had from that brokerage report, it doesn't exist. It never did. It's a fantasy. That's part of the fantasy of the stock market. Now, when the stock market was first started, and the reason it's called the stock market is because it was originally based on farm livestock, the idea was that you would invest your money and you would get earnings and dividends. The actual price of the stock itself was supposed to be calculated based on the earnings and dividends that you would get from that ownership. But especially since 2008, Wall Street has gone on this incredible orgy of wild speculation. They don't want to buy a stock and hang on to it for 20 years. They want to buy a stock and then dump it as quickly as they can for them as much immediate profit as they can. And yes, they'll game the system to drive those numbers up so they can make more money. They can do a pump and dump. For most people, that would be illegal. For the plunge protection team, well, everybody looks the other way there. But the danger of an overvalued stock market, and right now, to me, it looks like it's more overvalued than it was all the way back in 1929. The first time there's a major sell-off, the entire market will collapse down to where the underlying value of the stock justifies that price. And right now, that's a very long way to go. If there's a sudden sell-off, only the first people in, the insiders who've been told it's coming, will get their money out. Everybody else is going to be left with a very impressive looking number on the bottom of that brokerage report and nothing else. An overvalued market is not a good thing, especially for long-term investors. Now, as you know, a lot of people admire Iceland. Populists and sovereigntists admire Iceland for what they did in the wake of the 2008 meltdown of the mortgage-backed security fraud. Basically, 26 Icelandic bankers have gone to prison, and the government ordered a bank sale to benefit the citizens who'd been defrauded by those banksters. And that was seen as a very, very good thing. Well, despite the corporate media's insistence that nobody ever remember what happened in Iceland, over in Switzerland there are now activists who are standing up to the banking cartels, and they've successfully petitioned to bring an initiative for a public referendum that would attack the private banks where it matters most. Their power to lend money they don't actually have and create money out of thin air. Switzerland is going to have a referendum saying banks cannot loan money they don't actually have. It will be a death knell for the private central bankers. No more fractional reserve banking. No more creating money out of thin air to loan to the public at interest. In other words, the private central banks are going to be forced to operate as commercial depositor banks. And they may not be able to. When Andrew Jackson revoked the charter of the Second Bank of the United States and took away their ability to create money out of thin air, the Second Bank of the United States tried to operate as a regular bank, and they failed after only 2 years. Depositor banks and private central banks are two completely separate things. Don't let the word bank fool you. Depositor banks collect together deposits, they loan it on out. It's a very important social function of pooling unused money in a society and putting it to good use. Private central banks are essentially legalized counterfeiting operations that are granted their right to create money out of thin air by corrupt governments who sell the people of their nation into the slavery of this system. And that's exactly what private central banking is. It's a system of enslavement. Now, over in the Eurozone, numbers are not looking too good over there. Spain, Italy, and Greece owe more than €1 trillion to the European Central Bank. That's trillion with a T. And market conditions are showing signs of a return to the conditions that sparked the 2011 debt crisis. Over in Greece, it is now so bad. There is so little actual currency in circulation because the money junkies grabbed it all. Companies are starting to pay workers in supermarket coupons. It's sort of a way of creating a parallel currency. The companies are going to the supermarkets and saying, we will pay you so much for the coupons, we're going to pay our employees in the coupons, the employees will come to the store, redeem the coupons for the food. That's how it's working. Now, imagine a system where you work all day long, and all you get for that work is food. We had a system like that in the antebellum South in this country. And that, of course, is what the private central bankers want. A return to serfdom, feudalism, where the bankers own everything on the planet, and you are allowed to live only so long as you are of use to them. And you will work all day long, and you will be allowed to eat and stay in hovels that they own, shacks. And if you didn't figure it out yet, that's what that new micro house thing is. You've seen them, the little tiny micro houses, the micro homes. It's a slave shack with up-to-date paint job is what's going on here. Now, we've been talking about Germany and how Germany has been, for most of its history, since World War II, an economic powerhouse. And indeed, Germany and Great Britain working together have borne the brunt of the economic predations foisted on the European Union by the ECB and the IMF and the World Bank. Germany has also, unfortunately, been struggling with the high costs of the migrant crisis. And now, apparently, poverty in Germany is reaching a new record high. 15.7% in 2015, that's the last year they have the accurate numbers for. 12.9 German people are now living in poverty. That was certainly not the case when I was working in Germany back in the 1980s. It was a very prosperous, wealthy country. Everybody had jobs. Everybody had a comfortable life. And now they're being driven down into poverty. Because of that one message we will always hear from the private central bankers and the money junkies. You must make do with less so we can have more. You must make do with less so we can have more. You must make do with less so we can have more. That's it. That's their entire philosophy of life. More for us, less for you. It's not enough that we should succeed. All the rest of you must fail. I think that was Attila the Hun. I may be wrong on that one. Poroshenko is over there talking to the IMF saying they need their next billion-dollar tranche to have room to breathe. Apparently, they've already gone through all the money that's been poured into that country. And again, this coup d'etat, this U.S. coup d'etat in Kiev has turned out to be a complete disaster. Look at how much harm, pain, hunger, misery, suffering, war has been brought to planet Earth by these money junkies. It's time we recognize they are, in fact, seriously mentally ill, and I'm sure the prescription antidepressants are only making things worse. Now, as you know, we're coming up on the House vote on Obamacare Light or Ryan Care, whatever you want to call it. And there's an interesting article over here, why Obamacare is the biggest fraud in American history and was designed to be exactly that. And yes, that's what it was. The Affordable Care Act was written by the health insurance corporations, who then donated to the politicians to get this thing turned into law. And it was about taking away affordable health insurance for the American people and forcing them to buy much more expensive policies with sky-high deductibles to boost profits to the health insurance corporations. Now, unfortunately, it's looking like this Ryan Care is basically a repackaging of the same thing. It's a pander to the health insurance corporations who are promising generous campaign donations for future political careers. At some point, some bright person in the government is going to look out across this land and realize that this government of the scammers, by the scammers, and for the scammers is headed for a major fall because there is no more money out here for them to take. Whether it's the carbon tax the Obamacare scam, the mandated vaccine scam, it all breaks down in a country that is impoverishing its own workforce. And it stuns me they can't see it because of their money addiction. Now, Chuck Schumer. Remember back in 2013, Chuck Schumer blocked the Republicans' attempt to defund Obamacare by shutting the government down for 16 days, by refusing to negotiate on a special bill that would have been an emergency funding bill to keep the government working past the debt ceiling. We're past the current debt ceiling, and once again, Senator Chuck Schumer is saying that he will block any kind of an emergency funding bill unless Donald Trump reverses his course on immigration. Just open those borders back on up. Our lords and masters over at the New World Order want those borders open. We hear and we obey. Now, apparently up in Maryland at high school, 2 illegal aliens who were attending English classes there raped, sodomized, and forced oral sex on a 14-year-old girl. Grabbed her, took her into a bathroom stall, and abused her. They've arrested these 2, and they are scheduled for deportation now after the damage is done. So how is that sanctuary city thing working out for you, Maryland? Is that working for you? Okay, we'll be right back after these few words. Aloha, America. Welcome back to our show here. Now, as I mentioned briefly earlier in the show, and I'm going to go into it in a little more depth now, apparently a group of 60 conservative members of Parliament, including former cabinet ministers Lane Duncan Smith and Teresa Villers, plus a bunch of Tory peers and so forth, they've all signed a letter written to the Director General of the BBC saying that the only reason the Brexit vote succeeded was the BBC's pessimistic and skewed coverage of what's going on in Europe. That if the BBC had not been reporting on the migrant crisis in Europe and all the violent crime and rape going on over there, if the BBC had refrained from reporting on the economic hardships that were going on in Europe, that Brexit would have failed and the New World Order would be just absolutely delighted about what's going on. Now, obviously, Article 50 is scheduled to trigger on the 29th, and that begins the process to basically Brexit at that point is a reality. And there's going to be all kinds of negotiations back and forth about severing all of the ties. Personally, I think Britain ought to just put a gate on that channel. You cut all the lines of communication for the banking computers and say, we're out, we're gone here. Brussels is still trying to throw roadblocks in the way. They're talking about a divorce settlement payment. That one went absolutely nowhere. And looking at this attack on the BBC by all of these hardcore Remainers, it looks like there's going to be another attempt to derail Brexit somehow, by hook or by crook. Now, I can't imagine that Europe will actually try and invade Great Britain to bring it back into the fold the way the Union invaded the Confederacy. But at this point, the globalists have to be in a state of panic to the point where they're openly out there trying to reassert control over their empire. And we're starting to find out more and more that populist politicians, Eurosceptics, sovereigntists are being campaigned against and in many cases actually interfered with. The British police are now saying Nigel Farage lost his election in 2015 to election fraud. We saw a massive election fraud in the Scottish independence referendum. There was a lot of fraud in the Brexit vote, not enough. A lot of fraud in our vote, not enough. Looks like there was fraud in Geert Wilders' election, and on and on and on. And we're all seeing it now. Now, up in Germany, they have a satire TV show out there saying, go ahead, Britain, you can leave, you know, who needs you? Turkey is about to join the EU. We'll have Turkey instead of Britain, everything will be fine. Actually, small difference. The refugees are trying to get into Great Britain. The refugees are trying to get out of Turkey. I don't really think it's a clean swap. Now, the House has just passed... Oh, there's the music. Got to do a quick station identification. We'll be right back.